Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for the next installment in the Grenzebach-Glier & Associates webinar series, Major and Planned Gift Portfolio Analysis, GG+A's approach to optimizing portfolios and managing performance. Today's webinar is co-presented by Dan Lohman, Senior Vice President, GG+A Philanthropic Analytics, and Matthew Slovit, Solutions Consultant. Since joining the firm 11 years ago, Dan Lohman has served hundreds of client organizations. An award-winning public speaker, Dan's expertise includes prospect management, research, analytics, and prospect identification. Before joining GG+A last year, Matthew Slovit worked as an associate consultant with the Wayland Group, a strategic advisory firm to nonprofits, and as an analyst with JP Morgan, where he worked in the syndicated and leveraged finance group. Today's session will discuss the use of analytical tools to examine the value of managed and unmanaged prospects. It will further offer a framework to ensure prospects are being managed according to their value, develop a means to evaluate portfolios within and across units and programs, and discuss how to build key management tools, including an effective prospect management process and a gift pipeline report. Finally, today's webinar will provide a comprehensive look at best practices, common errors made by institutions in making assignments, and concrete steps to enhance prospect management processes. Our presenters welcome any questions you have during today's session, and we'll answer those questions in the time remaining at the end of the hour. To address a question to Dan and Matthew, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, select All Participants from the drop-down menu, and send us your questions. Any questions we do not get a chance to answer today will be addressed in a follow-up message we send next week. Tomorrow afternoon, we will send a recording of the session along with the presentation slides, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. Thank you again for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Dan Lohman to get us started.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks to everyone for taking some time to join us on this webinar today. I guess I was going to say good afternoon, but there are people in the early morning all the way through evening, so it's always nice to see such a wide range of participants. A couple opening notes. Many of you have participated in GG+A webinars before, and we've historically kept them to be purely on educational topics, speaking generally about what we see at nonprofit organizations and their fundraising shops. And we want to stick to that general theme, although today's focus really is on a GG+A approach to something. We've spent the last several years working closely with a whole range of institutions, and I'll talk about that range in just a moment, but optimizing portfolios for both major and planned gifts, as well as leadership annual giving. And we really wanted to focus this time because we've had a lot of questions on how do we do that. Yet at the same time, we want to leave you with things that you can implement immediately or at your organizations with or without GG+A's participation. A related note, many of the examples that we're going to use in today's presentation are focused on higher education, and the sample slides come from a decentralized higher education environment. But don't let that let you think that that will ultimately result in your inability to do these things. This works well in any kind of environment, in healthcare, and cultural organizations, and advocacy organizations. And while we will have to use our imaginations at certain points when we're looking at a slide that talks about a business school, for example, that could just as easily apply to a unit within a hospital, to a geographic region, and indeed, we've gone through an exercise like this with small independent schools, private colleges, social service agencies, where in some cases they only have 1 or 2 portfolios to analyze as opposed to the 60, 70, 150 that we might see at a large organization. And the value of the overall process, I think, remains the same. It's just a question of institutional complexity and what your needs are. So within that context, Matthew and I are going to balance this in terms of 2 components of the presentation. For the first piece, we're going to go back and forth a little bit as we introduce the concept, and then Matthew will speak for a longer period of time about the prospect analysis component of this. How do we rate individuals within a database in order to prioritize them for the portfolio analysis, and then I'll finish the presentation with a discussion of that portfolio analysis component, and we'll close out both with your questions and some takeaways of things you can do at your own organizations immediately.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Dan. This is Matthew Slovett. I'm a colleague of Dan's in the Philanthropic Analytics Group. Well, there are many objectives that drive a rigorous portfolio analysis process and outcomes that arise from that analysis. The 5 shown here are common goals that we've observed in a variety of clients that we've worked with over the years. In no particular order, just want to go through these somewhat quickly to frame the conversation or the presentation that we're going to go through today. First, the importance of establishing a vocabulary to rate and prioritize constituents that is consistent across the institution and understood, accepted, and supported by all staff members. One of the things that we observe a lot when clients are embarking upon a portfolio analysis is the discussion around, are gift officers going to be a part of the process, and is there going to be staff buy-in? One of the things that Dan and I will talk throughout the presentation is the importance that this be an ongoing framework, that this isn't just a point-in-time static analysis. Second, increase the likelihood that prospects are being managed according to their value. We believe one of the hallmarks of a portfolio analysis is instilling a data and metric-driven culture. There's a variety of institutions on the call today. Some already have that instilled. Some want to improve in that area. This is a process in which that will be helpful. Third, transparently evaluate the size, quality, and compositions of portfolios at the officer, unit, and organizational level. Tying in with the first point I made about the importance of staff buy-in, we strongly recommend that the methodology and findings of the analysis be shared throughout the organization to further support and promote staff buy-in and commitment to incorporate the results and the recommendations in colleagues' day-to-day work. Fourth, clearly track the movement of prospects throughout the prospect management process. Towards the end of the presentation, Dan's going to go into greater detail into the importance of creating or further refining a prospect stage management process. The 2 critical components of a portfolio analysis are the value of portfolios and then also looking at that value and how it changes over time. And then 5th, formalize a protocol so that this becomes an internal process. As I mentioned at the outset, this is a framework and not a point-in-time analysis, and we really want it to, or hope, at least in the clients that we work with and organizations that embark upon a portfolio analysis, that the information is updated on a regular basis and really does become an integral part of a development program.
Major and planned gift programs are typically organized around gift officer portfolios. And I'm going to make a declarative statement here. If your organization has a major and planned gift program that's not organized around portfolios, I strongly encourage you to do so. By portfolios, I mean specifically being able to identify those constituents that we as an organization believe are good prospects for cultivation and ultimate solicitation, or at least qualification, depending on where that constituent falls in their relationship with you. And again, our approach to this ultimately is how do we value portfolios and compare them and make sure that they're as efficient as they can be. I do want to emphasize that this applies to any part of your program that involves portfolios. So major and planned gifts are certainly an obvious example, but leadership annual giving programs are also a good place for this, even though those portfolios might be quite a bit larger than they are in a major gift scenario. Most institutions that we work with are able to tell us who their gift officers are, although you'd actually be surprised how occasionally they can't number all of their staff. But they can tell us who their gift officers are, and they can tell us how many prospects each of those gift officers is managing in a portfolio. And that number ranges widely from less than 50 to more than several hundred. A little bit later, we might talk about optimal portfolio sizes. But beyond that raw count, most organizations have trouble answering some other questions. What's the value of those portfolios? How much giftable capacity is actually in that pool of names that we're working with? Or even at a relative scale, is this portfolio more valuable than another portfolio? Composition and time frame. Are these prospects that are primarily tied up in what we might call qualification or stewardship on the opposite ends of a spectrum, or are they in proposal stage or solicitation stage, and therefore can we start to forecast with greater accuracy the dollar values that might start to come in as gifts in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, as opposed to just saying these are good prospects and we think they'll come in sometime, but it's hard to say when. And then the last two, which are a little more subjective, where are there opportunities for improvement, and how can we create some measures of performance and progress? By improvement, I think we're looking broadly at the concept of efficiency. If we're talking to 100 to 150 people this year about major gifts, are we talking to the 100 to 150 that are as likely to be the best prospects as we can muster for any given program, gift officer's experience level, et cetera? And how can we start to shift out prospects that may be consuming time and resources without a lot of value and move in qualification or discovery prospects that we can spend more time with and plan for a longer-term cultivation effort? And by measures of performance, I want to be clear that I'm not specifically talking about measuring job performance. That portfolio analysis can have some applications there, but it's really not designed as a mechanism to say you're a good gift officer versus this one over here who's not as effective as you are. I think it's to look at performance in terms of how do we keep track of what can be hundreds or thousands of names? How do we make sure nobody falls through the cracks and that we don't communicate with someone at a critical moment? How do we make sure that we're having the right number of conversations face-to-face, on the phone, through the mail, whatever? But how can we structure that in a way so that it creates an efficiency for the gift officer as well as a reporting structure for management so you can keep better track of where a process is for any one gift officer, unit, or institution in a way that's ultimately very systematic.
With Dan's remarks, I think it's hopefully becoming clear that there are many, many applications of a portfolio analysis. I think another title for this presentation could be how to structure a major gifts department and how to evaluate it on an ongoing basis. Some of the things that we have observed as the most common applications, or at least are the things that we find clients are seeking as critical objectives in the near term, are looking at a way to transparently evaluate prospects within portfolios and the process for how they're assigned to officers. The portfolio analysis, whether done internally or with an external partner, it's critical to make sure that it's a fair and universal system across officers within a unit and across the institution, and that officers are aware of that process so that a fact-based and data-driven approach is clearly understood and can be continually referenced as a baseline for how prospects are being assigned and unassigned and potentially shifted or reassigned between officers. It's also a tool for understanding how to deploy resources, whether it be personnel or non-personnel. I mean, there's aspects of this analysis that drive an officer's week-to-week tasks, but there's also aspects of it that become essential to a manager's ability to manage and drive growth within a department. And to something that Dan mentioned earlier, just to reinforce, is how helpful this analysis becomes when a program is trying to project fundraising results. The build-up, which I'll go into a little bit later in the presentation, of looking at the intersection between portfolio valuation by capacity and affinity and prospect stage analysis, it becomes clear to see how having that information, especially when it's current and has been updated on an ongoing basis, becomes such a nice set of data points to more accurately forecast.
before we really get into the heart of how to go about this process, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what portfolio analysis is not. I want to differentiate between prospect analysis and portfolio analysis. Prospect analysis is a process, which we're going to describe in some detail in just a moment, of looking at each individual record in a database system at an organization and evaluating their likelihood to make a gift or strength of relationship to you, as well as their capacity to make a gift. And again, we're going to go into some detail about how we can approach that both at the internal institutional level, from external sources, or a hybrid approach. And it's a necessary precursor to a portfolio analysis. We need a framework or a vocabulary to describe the value of prospects that we can then roll up into portfolios that we've created, that we can then divide into institutional units or organizational structures, and ultimately, as you'll see later in the presentation, move into a staging system that allows us to keep track of where individuals are in a pro forma system to move them from first contact to gift and then back around to the next gift. Another thing portfolio analysis is not is a piece of software, or a piece of technology, or a dashboard. It's a framework that enables information to flow out of your data management systems into the hands of decision makers, gift officers, prospect managers, prospect researchers, in a way to make you more efficient, focused on the right prospects, and do that on a wholesale basis. Again, something we're going to talk about as we go through this. The technology is important, don't get me wrong. All of this data has to exist in an internal donor management system, and reports have to be generated from that. And there are all kinds of companies out there that provide donor management systems, as well as bolt-ons that provide reporting capabilities associated with this. But those pieces of technology alone don't do anything. What we really, all they do is report. And what we want to focus on in this conversation is the content that feeds that reporting structure.
Now we're going to go into a little bit more detail around the different components of portfolio analysis. I'm going to focus a little bit on the initial building blocks of what sort of data gets gathered that incorporates the analysis. Dan mentioned that portfolio analysis is not prospect analysis, and that's right, but prospect analysis is a component and is one of the starting building blocks for the portfolio analysis. So I even mentioned a couple times, but brief concept overview, we're evaluating portfolios to build an effective gift pipeline, and we want it to coordinate with existing prospect management guidelines. We don't necessarily want this to become, let me restate, we want the portfolio analysis to be part of the solution within the framework that your particular organizations are already working under. Looking at the rating of affinity and inclination, the prospect assessment of what is the capacity of an individual and the likelihood of that individual to give to your particular institution. The important factors here are we want to include relationship factors, affiliation type, whether they're a parent, alum, friend, what is their past giving frequency, recency, volunteer engagement. All of these factors will be useful in indicating whether a prospect is a warm or a cold prospect. Is this someone that is closely affiliated with your institution, or is it someone that is more on the periphery? And we want to build a framework to easily identify those prospects that are closer so that we could optimize the resource allocation to the high-value prospects to drive fundraising performance at your organization. The other thing, this middle bullet point, is really important about applying a consistent rating process across the whole entire institution. And also, it should be somewhat simple and logical so that the rating process doesn't become such a resource strain that you don't get the opportunity to move on to the more sophisticated overlays, which is actually the portfolio analysis. This is the first building block. It's important that it's consistent, but you don't want the rating process to become the end-all of the analysis. The predictive modeling process of looking at a prospect's likelihood to give to your institution is really looking at a combination of characteristics that you track internally, that giving information, what was their original connection to your organization, whether it be as a parent of a child in the higher education context, or parent of a child that received medical services, or is it a friend, a variety of characteristics that give an indication of the individual's relationship with the institution. And then that information you're tracking internally, hopefully systematically, in your donor management systems. But it's also important to incorporate external data, demographic data like age, where that hasn't maybe been captured, or marital status, or presence of children, length of residence, home ownership versus renter. You could imagine as we expand the universe of characteristics that we're able to attach to each individual prospect, whether internally or with an external partner, you're able to take all these variables and feed them into a model. That's where the predictive modeling title comes from, that is used to attach ratings to the individual prospects. This slide, page 10, is just a sample of some of the ratings that we use at GG+A. There are other firms that use different ratings, and there are organizations that internally have developed their own ratings. These three categories will be common to all of you: annual giving, planned giving, and major gift code. And here we've just attached a numerical or an alphabetical tag to indicate the differentiation between high-value prospects in the major gift code, planned giving, the prospects that are most likely to be your best planned giving prospects, I should say, and then an annual giving hierarchy. This is just one example.
And I want to emphasize here, while this is our approach to this, that there is no right answer in the way you formulate the rating system itself. I think the key rules are there's a mechanism to say highly affiliated to unaffiliated, or high likelihood to very low likelihood, and that, as Matthew said a moment ago, this can be applied wholesale. It's not a question of staff going through record by record and assigning their view of what this is. That's an important process later in the cultivation and qualification process, but at this stage it needs to be wholesale, and that it's transparent, that we know what the rules are going into it, and the same rules are applied to everyone in the constituency, so we can say and defend why someone might be a D versus an A, or whatever your parlance is, from green to red, or any other such structure.
The other side of the prospect analysis is the wealth screening, which is looking at the capacity of an individual to give. Predictive modeling is looking at the affinity or likelihood of that individual to give to your particular institution, wealth screening being the capacity of an individual to give to any nonprofit. Many of you on this call have done wealth screening analysis or are familiar with its methodology. It's the intersection of these two that inform the prospect analysis that is the basic building block to evaluating portfolios. Now we're going to take a look at some sample slides from reports that GG+A has done. These are just illustrative examples of the type of ways we use the prospect rating information that we just walked through with the predictive modeling and the wealth screening. But there's a variety of different ways to approach it, and these are just some samples from our work. If you take a look at page 13, this is a table. This is one of my favorite slides in the prospect analysis reports that we do. And it's very simply speaking, looking at the distinction between assigned prospects and unassigned prospects on a university-wide basis. So if you take a look at the top table, these are the assigned prospects. There's 9,746 assigned prospects at this institution. And you'll notice on the x-axis has those major gift codes that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and then on the y-axis are the gift capacity ratings. So if we plot prospects on this grid, we could see that in the lower right-hand corner, those prospects that are shaded in that orangish or beige box, there's 3,155 that we're tagging as low priority. Through our analysis, they got a major gift code of a D or an E and have a gift capacity rating of 5 or lower. This box, we'll see in a little bit of later slides, there's not necessarily any magic to where this box is placed on this table per se, and it may differ from unit to unit or what thresholds are at certain institutions. But here we have, at least through the prospect analysis, an indication, a data-driven observation that the capacity and the affinity of these individuals would lead one to believe that they may not warrant valuable gift officer time. On the lower half of the page, we're looking at the unassigned prospects. At this institution, there are 135,159 unassigned prospects, an enormous number. But if we look at the green shaded box in the upper left-hand corner of that lower table, we'll see that there's 1,558 what we're calling high priority prospects, high capacity, high affinity individuals. It probably warrants a discussion to think about potentially replacing some of the low capacity, low affinity prospects in that orange box in the upper table with some of these unassigned high priority prospects in the lower table. It's this type of analysis that then can inform discussions of gift officer portfolios, composition, and the potential point of a gift officer maybe saying they don't feel like there are enough good prospects to go around for all the gift officers in a department. It's this type of analysis that could say, well, there's actually just under 1,600 that at least warrant some verification of why they're not in portfolios. The resource implications of this, many of you are probably thinking, my gosh, but the resource implications are important to think about, and it's something that we encourage clients to think about at the outset before embarking upon this analysis, and then also continually returning to it so that it is a part of the day-to-day or week-to-week work processes at all your organizations. In thinking about the challenge of you have 1,000 high-priority unassigned prospects, how can you develop an effective and manageable framework for assigning these prospects? Here we've just given some examples of what is the prioritization of what buckets these unassigned prospects should fall into. Is it school of first degree, school of any degree, dormitory that they graduated from, an extracurricular that they may have been involved in? Were they in an a cappella group? Were they on the football team? Are they a parent? And then also, leave it for my last remark on this slide of giving. We have observed in a lot of client environments, school of first degree is often the primary indicator of where prospects are placed. Our strong recommendation is that you follow the money first and foremost. It sounds somewhat obvious, but you'd be surprised how many institutions do not first look at giving history in the consideration of where to place prospects.
Just a couple of quick points on this as well. Obviously, these examples are from higher education, but a little bit of imagination will go a long way as we think about medical thematic area, if we think about how museums or cultural organizations might be divided. Obviously, it's whatever works for you. A smaller organization that's very centralized and has only a couple of portfolio carrying gift officers, this step may be largely irrelevant in terms of saying we've got a few hundred good, unidentified, unmanaged prospects according to this analysis. How do we divvy them up against our small centralized staff as part of a qualification process?
That's a great point, Dan. On slide 15, that just real briefly, this is just one example of an assignment rule schema that we might consider setting up or having a discussion with the client about incorporating in their process of looking at dollars contributed over a recent time period, 5 years is shown here, then dollars contributed over the lifetime, looking at parent relationship, and then some extracurriculars, school of first three. There's many variations on this table, but as I said on the prior page, we do strongly recommend that contributions is one of the first priorities and one of the first places that you look when determining where to place a prospect. The next two slides I want to just gloss over quickly because I want to give Dan an opportunity to speak in greater detail about this prospect analysis that's informing the portfolio analysis. But these next two slides just take a look at an individual unit. Slide 16 is the business school and slide 17 is engineering and applied science. You'll recall from a couple slides earlier we were looking at the university-wide, but that's not how most institutions are oriented. The discussion about prospect, assignment, and replacement occurs in many institutions at the unit level. So looking at the number of prospects that are high capacity, high affinity that are unassigned versus that low capacity, low affinity that are assigned. And then if there's the discussions going to be had in coordination with the unit and maybe a central office, then return to some of the assignment rules that you've designed at the outset of if the money is being split between two units, maybe there's a primary and a secondary assignment with gift officers. So these two slides are just examples of the drill down that you can do at the unit level. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Dan to see how all this feeds into the portfolio analysis.
At this stage, a large number or all of the individuals in your constituent population have been rated. And again, there's a lot of mechanisms to get to that rating. But ultimately, we've put people on a scale, in this example, from A through E for strength of relationship, where A is the best, and from capacity of $10 million or more down to less than $2,500. And as we move into, and as Matthew finished up his portion there describing how we've then broken it out into primary affiliations. And again, that's going to have to be flexible and customized at any particular organization based on your own structure, size, and complexity. But ultimately, those slides that we looked at for the business school and engineering and applied science could just as easily be done for a specific gift officer for a region of the country or any other related structure. Now that they're rated, we can apply a value to each prospect and then portfolio within the population. So effectively, the way we would go about that is, the simplest formula you'll ever hear from me is multiply could against would, and you get the adjusted value, where the could is how much do we think they're capable of giving. Is it $10 million? Is it $5,000? Is it some number in between? And the would is that strength of relationship, where the A's we think are highly likely to want to support an institution at a high level, where the E's we think are much less likely to want to do so. And how you structure that handicap can vary widely, but for the sake of example, just think of it this way. If we assume that an A-rated prospect could give all of their capacity to you, a B-rated prospect maybe only 75%, drop down to the Ds, maybe that's 20%, and the Es, at some organizations we've done 0, other organizations we have seen lower percentages, 5%, 7%. Just to give you an example, in a never donor non-alumni population, 0 is probably a good estimate, where in a grateful patient population, there's still a decent chance that those people could be activated through a qualification exercise. On this sample report, which is actually a real report from an institution where we have protected the innocent with the initials, you can start to see how we can turn this into a mechanism to evaluate the quality of portfolios. So the way to read this is just across the top row. Development Officer BE has 27 prospects in their portfolio. The portfolio itself is valued at $127.5 million. So again, we've taken their A-rated prospects and said that they could give as much as $10 million if that's how they've been rated. We've taken their E prospects and said we're going to value those people at 0, even though they're in the portfolio. And still, this person with only 27 prospects has $127 million in capacity, an average value of $4.7 million per prospect. This is a very appropriate portfolio for a chief development officer, a principal gifts officer. It's a small portfolio, but the value is extremely high, and the average prospect value is at true principal gifts levels. As you look down through the list, you can start to see some changes. Take a look at Development Officer BM, about a third of the way down, 163 prospects in the portfolio. So a much larger portfolio on the bounds of too big for most major gift officers. $79 million in capacity and an average prospect value of about $485,000. So 1/10 the average prospect value, but many, many more constituents. I would actually argue while that portfolio is a bit on the large side for most people, it's still an appropriate portfolio, that most of the prospects appear to be stronger prospects. Their average value is above the threshold for the definition of a major gift at this institution. And as we start to look at some of the other portfolios, my concerns start to shift around. Down at the bottom, Development Officer BR, 448 prospects in their portfolio. You just can't make 448 phone calls. You can't make 448 face-to-face visits. The portfolio is simply too large. Some value of $70.6 million, which doesn't look bad at first blush until you divide it by 448, and we find that the average value is $157,000. Only 23% of this portfolio's prospects got a rating of A, B, or C in our mechanism, which we would consider to be higher likelihood prospects. And the balance, 77%, we consider to be much lower likelihood prospects. Again, at first glance, without having any other information, I would say we should probably look for an opportunity to reduce 448 to a more manageable number, retaining the A's, B's, and C's with high capacities primarily, and have that gift officer focus their energy on 150 or 200 prospects that are in the better group. That said, there may be internal structural reasons that this actually turns out to be a reasonable portfolio that we can evaluate. For example, if there's a large discovery population, if there are 448 names in the pool right now, but we expect to make 200 discovery visits over the next 18 months, say, and intend to disqualify some number of these or qualify them and move them into cultivation, either in gift officer BR's portfolio or spread out to another gift officer. This report, which displays much the same structure. Instead of being organized by gift officer, has now been rolled up by institutional unit. And of course, there's a lot of applications for this kind of reporting. If we look from department to department, we can start to get at the answers to all kinds of questions. From the management level, certainly staffing comes into play, that if we're looking at units that have much larger numbers of prospects at much higher quantifiable values, we can start to make a case that medicine or law or business or social work needs another gift officer or two or three, depending on the numbers that we see here. In other cases, we might have ultimately an opposite argument where we may be overstaffed, that perhaps 2 or 3 units could share a single gift officer instead of having their own, if indeed there are only 30 or 40 or 50 top prospects for a small unit that may not have an inherently affluent constituency. The next report then looks within units at the gift officers that are affiliated with each one. Again, the principle becomes the same of how can we use this information to say some of these portfolios don't have the strongest prospects. We may even find certain individual tidbits of information like a single gift officer or director of development in a unit or area of your organization that's basically hogging all the good prospects, so that they have 200 fabulous prospects and their 3 associate directors of major gifts in their unit have large portfolios of dubious value. Again, that's something that could be addressed in this quantitative approach of how can we redistribute some of those names in a more appropriate fashion. I want to spend a few minutes talking about prospect stages. Stages are a capability of most of the common donor management systems. Certainly in systems like Razor's Edge and Advance and Millennium, those kinds of things, the capability exists in various ways, and you have quite a bit of flexibility in how you structure it. And my sense is that these pieces of information are often underused. They're not well maintained by many field gift officers who ultimately would be responsible for keeping it up to date. There aren't clear definitions. I had a conversation with someone yesterday where I believe their quote was, "One person's qualification is another person's cultivation." And that's a good point. And clear definitions become important, and why I think stages are important is to be able to stay focused on the entire continuum of the fundraising process. And I want to show you an example of a staging system that I happen to like, which is why I'm showing it, but there's many ways to approach this, so don't think this is the only way to do it. Here we've organized all assigned prospects into 6 distinct categories: identification, qualification, all the way through stewardship. And we've put a time frame on each one of those categories. And as you can see on the flow chart, there's a basic question that provides a general definition of where someone might be staged. I'm going to jump ahead and then jump back to this slide, but I wanted to show you what would be the follow-on to that cover page, which is 6 other pages that look like this. This is the advanced cultivation stage, where this organization has created a very clear definition, a clear definition of when you exit from that stage and how long an individual ought to remain in that stage before there's a reevaluation of prospect movement, prospect management within that pipeline. What this allows is, first, the opportunity for a restaging exercise. If you're not happy with the current quality of stage data in your system, you can take this as an opportunity to clarify the stages and their definitions, and then go back to your gift officers and say, here's a list of people in your portfolio, here are their 6 possible stages with definitions. Please indicate by Friday which stage you think they're in. In a little bit of an aside on motivation, I had a large university client that was having a difficulty many of you will identify with. Much of the staff was happy to go ahead with the restaging, but it was in particular the rock star gift officers, the people raising millions and millions every year who knew they were not going to get fired or suffer any consequences if they didn't take the hour to do this restaging exercise. So what the vice president ultimately did was promise a pizza party for each unit that got their restaging in on time. So what ended up happening was junior staff, administrative staff, other gift officers within the unit started to pester and harass the senior gift officer who wasn't filling out the form so that they could get their pizza party. They had 100% compliance within 6 days. It was beautiful. That's very nuts and bolts. So let me move back up to 50,000 feet. Something else that I think is valuable about this exercise and a time and stage report that I'll talk about in just a minute is most prospect management discussions, in my experience, focus on what you've done in the last 3 weeks and what you're going to do in the next 3 weeks. So it's who did we just meet with? Who are we about to submit a proposal to? What's the follow-up on the people we just met with? And what that causes to happen is a bit of a recycling in the prospect management system where we're focused on people that are in this schema, advanced cultivation, proposal, and closing, and we kind of stop paying attention to identification, qualification, and early cultivation, which frankly is the hardest part of fundraising, of getting to know someone, develop the relationship, discover their interests, and start to craft a proposal around those interest areas. Consistently measuring prospects that are in each of these stages and then using the timelines as a trigger to say, here are 8 people that were in identification 6 months ago. 6 months have passed and they're all still in identification. What's the next step? Do we reassign them? Do we throw them to the annual fund? Do we develop a prospect strategy around these names? And then it facilitates a discussion in that prospect management environment to say, we're not just who are we delivering a proposal to next week, but how are we moving these people we've just met to the next stage, which helps ensure a healthy pipeline. This, Matthew talked about his favorite slide in the presentation. This is my favorite slide in the presentation. These are assigned constituents at one unit in an institution. That's only relevant because on the right-hand side, we're comparing them against a university average. This could be done by a single gift officer. You don't have to have units for this slide to be useful. And I think the upper left-hand corner is actually fairly straightforward and is a fairly common report, the number of prospects in each of the stages. And at first glance, it actually doesn't look terrifying. The number of prospects in identification and early cultivation is big, but that's okay because we don't know these people and some will become disqualified. There's a healthy number in advanced cultivation, proposal, and closing. And again, probably a big number, but not terrifyingly large on the stewardship side. What we've been able to add through the portfolio analysis and the prospect valuation is the lower left-hand corner, where now we can assign a capacity value to each of those stages. So, okay, there's 24 constituents that have prospects that have proposals in front of them, but they only have $1.48 or $1.46 million worth of total capacity in a portfolio that is worth about $25–30 million in total capacity. The vast majority of the money in this portfolio is tied up in stewardship. All of a sudden, the word terrifying becomes into the vocabulary here. This person's pipeline is really at risk. There's not a whole lot of money moving toward a short-term solicitation, and some rebalancing might be in order, especially when we consider that this person may be managing as many as 73 stewardship prospects who might be better handled through a stewardship office, a communications program, alumni relations, the annual fund, places other than the extremely limited resource of a major gift officer. On the right-hand side, we're looking at the percentage values by stage and then comparing a unit's values to a university-wide or institution-wide total. This one, again, is a true story from an actual organizational unit. And if you look in the far lower right-hand corner, the 66% of prospects that are in stewardship by capacity, the 66% of dollar value in capacity, compared to the university average of just 22%. The first discussion with this director of development was, well, it's the economy. We have a lot of stewardship prospects. It's not the right time to go back to them. But by seeing this 22% number on the university-wide basis, it starts to say, well, actually, it may not be the economy. It might be you. And nobody else seems to be having this problem on an institution-wide basis. So how do we evaluate those 73 prospects and determine if they can be shifted back into the cultivation cycle? The next slide, very briefly, it's the same concept. It's the same data. I just wanted to mention it because this organization has one big stage called cultivation. You wind up in it the moment you get into a portfolio, and you don't come out of it until we've determined how much we're going to ask someone for and when we're going to ask them. It's obviously, in this case, over 50% of the number of constituents are in cultivation, but we can't differentiate between I eventually want to call this person to I am about to ask this person for $5 million. So I'm a big fan of multiple early stages and perhaps collapsing some of the later stages. In terms of next steps, obviously we've talked about how we handle the assigned prospects and create this tracking mechanism, but then what do we do with the unassigned priority prospects? So remember from Matthew's discussion, we've now created an environment where we've said these are good prospects and we think they belong with a specific organizational unit as a starting place. It is only a starting place. There should be an appeal process, a prospect clearance system, a way to start to move people around into different categories. This is an example of a time and stage report where, as you can see on the left-hand side in the earlier dates, we're starting with 10 people in stage 4, cleared to solicit. And then looking month by month, how many new names have been added and how many names have been moved out, which again creates that framework for a manager to speak with development officers about keeping names moving throughout the entire process. Finally, this is looking at the unassigned population by units within an institution. The number of total prospects here at Arts and Sciences is huge, 57,000 people, a total value of $158 million, but a individual prospect value of just $2,800. Only 3% of the 57,000 are considered high likelihood prospects. So obviously, it doesn't make sense to say, let's take a close look at 57,000 people. We've taken enough of a look to say, let's focus on the 857 people at the top of this list, A's, B's, and C's rated above 100,000 in this example, and a value of $58 million, but the average value is going to be relatively high. So again, it puts us in a strong position to talk about staffing, deployment, prospect management portfolios, and creates a framework to distribute names to those gift officers, suggesting that we move them into a prospect management process and take them forward.
Dan's highlighted some of the things throughout his commentary about things that you can do immediately, but we thought it'd be helpful just to close the presentation with just clearly highlighting about 5 of them and want to make sure we leave some time for question and answer time. The first thing is, and Dan did a nice job of explaining the prospect stage process and going through the restaging exercise, and I love that anecdote that Dan said about how to get gift officers that are resistant to putting in the data.
They'll do anything for pizza.
The other thing that I just want to quickly say on that is we recognize that the initial restaging exercise will be incomplete and in some ways inaccurate, but that's okay, because what you've done is you've established the baseline where fast forward a month or 2 months, you can have discussions with individual officers, or individual officers could have discussions with themselves about there's now a set of prospects that if they, for example, dumped a lot of prospects into the cultivation stage that haven't moved to another stage, it really forces a discussion. Secondly is developing prospect movement reports. Something we said at the outset was that this is an analysis that shouldn't be a static point-in-time observation. It should be something that's incorporated in the work that you all do day to day, and it can become a management tool. explore options of whether you can do this in-house or you want to engage outside counsel. What is the capacity and or expertise of staff members to do this type of analysis? And also, is there value to engaging someone that has gone through the process before and knows what some of the challenges and pitfalls are and what's the best way to overcome them? Evaluating prospect assignment processes. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Just a few things on it. How is ownership justified? Consider establishing a prospect clearance process to streamline shifts in assignments so that there isn't a bottleneck of needing to get an AVP or a VP's approval to shift prospects from one portfolio to another, from one gift officer's assignment to another. And think about building in secondary and tertiary assignments where that could be useful if prospects have multiple interests at an institution. And then the last thing that Dan did highlight is consider changing the stewardship function. Many portfolios that we've observed have a disproportionate number of prospects in stewardship, and really thinking through very critically about what are the resource implications of having 50, 60 prospects in the stewardship stage, and is it realistic to think about a gift officer managing all those prospects in that stage while still meeting near-term goals of getting gifts into the door to support the missions of all your organizations. Well, that wraps up our formal presentation. Now we have a few minutes for questions, and hopefully we'll provide some good answers. Thank you very much, Matthew. We already have some questions from participants. Let me just get started with that. Dan and Matthew, this participant says that at her institution, the database has only limited information about its prospects. What should she do?
That's a good question. Many organizations have that question. Let me start with a common concern that we get is this isn't a good time for us to do this because we don't have a lot of data and we want to start collecting it. My question is then, when is a good time? Will it be in 3 years when you've collected all this information? Will it be in 5 years? I wouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good in this environment. Most organizations have pretty good gift data. And that's the most important thing in terms of a rating process. So if you lack event attendance data, I have some clients who can track who's been invited but not who's shown up to events. That's a good thing to put on the list of things to add. But with gift data, you can get a long way. Plus, there's a ton of stuff you can buy externally. There's lots of marketing companies and companies that serve this industry specifically that can add age, income, home value, those kinds of demographics that you can build in, and those data appends are rather inexpensive.
Dan and Matthew, another participant asked, how do you put a bottom line value on each gift officer's portfolio when using ranges? For example, how to count 10 prospects with capacity to give $500,000 to $1 million, for example?
That's a good question. We use, in our methodology, we go as conservative as we can, and we use the bottom of the range. So if we've rated someone at $100,000 to $250,000 for capacity and have given them an A rating, meaning high likelihood, we would count that value at $100,000, even though realistically it could go higher. Something worth noting on this entire process, trying to put a raw, precise value on any given individual through a strictly model-driven exercise is challenging. That ultimately, to put a number on a prospect, we probably need to do some comprehensive prospect research as well as have discussions with gift officers or leadership. So we're really looking at a wholesale approach here and a starting place. So that we can come up with these conservative estimates. It works in the aggregate, though, because some of the people we've rated at 100% of their capacity will overperform, and some will underperform, while some people we've said are very unlikely to give and don't have much capacity. Out of a group of tens of thousands, we're probably going to get some big gifts in that anyway. And ultimately, in the aggregate, we find these numbers work very well.
For Razor's Edge clients, do you recommend tracking through action tracks, proposal, or prospect status fields?
I have no idea. Sorry, my expertise within the Razor's Edge structure isn't good enough to answer the question with that level of specificity. We do have people here on staff who know that system much better than I do, and I'm happy to answer those questions specifically. If somebody just wants to shoot me an email, I'll put you in touch. We won't charge you for that answer.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Another participant asked, she notes that her institution doesn't structure major gift activity in portfolios. How is major gift portfolio analysis applicable to her program?
Ultimately, I think the answer is if there aren't metrics and there aren't organized portfolios, my answer would be maybe you should think about creating a system that includes them. Let's start with the portfolio component of that. All I mean by portfolio is we have clearly identified the people that we want to talk to about potentially making gifts. And then the next level of sophistication, we have associated those with specific staff people who are going to spearhead that effort. I think that in any organization, whether you've got one gift officer and 3,000 constituents, or if you've got 150 gift officers and 600,000 constituents, that organizational structure is a good rigor and a good discipline to make sure you're talking to the right people all of the time. On the metric side, I won't make a formal recommendation or form an opinion about whether or not metrics are good for your organization, but metrics in an evaluation sense. But I do think that metrics in terms of being able to keep on top of what you're doing, I mean, again, even if it's only just for your own benefit rather than organizational management benefit, to know you said you want to talk to 10 prospects and you haven't talked to those 10, to get a reminder every month that those people are still on your list and need some action, I think has a lot of value.
Well, thank you all once again for joining us today. We really appreciate your interest in our firm. Just as a reminder, the questions that we didn't get to today we'll address in a follow-up message next week. And tomorrow afternoon, we will send a recording of the session along with the presentation slides, as well as a short survey for your feedback. Thank you all once again.